Hello, everyone. We've got an important guest coming in today, so I'm going to do the housekeeping stuff very quickly at the beginning. Here's my song, Be Our Guest, Be Our Guest, Put Our Service to the Test. Thanks for coming to the Blue Boar Tavern, brought to you by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. If you're not joining us live, but are watching us from the future on the YouTube, we won't be able to answer comments because we'll be caught in like a time loop bubble where we can't communicate, but you can hit like and subscribe. And that really helps bring people who might not know much about the authorship question. It might bring them to them on YouTube. So thank you for that, for your support. We have a member who's missing, Phoebe. She's having a film shown in Europe. So we're so proud of her.
And she will be back in March.
Oh, March.
Back in March, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dorothea. Like I say, today we have a special guest. I'm honored. I've varnished the bar, polished the silverware. I was out vacuuming the sidewalk in front of the pub because in my mind, there's a handful of Oxfordian scholars that if something appears with their name on it, you know it's going to be good. And in that, I include our own Bonner, for one thing, Robert de Vere, Margot Anderson, Ramon Jimenez, Christopher Paul. There's a lot of them. But these are the ones I think of. He's among them, and he'll be joining us in a minute. And when he does, I'd like to say something to him personally, just a personal anecdote that I remember. I don't know if Roger. Hello, I'm introducing you. And
I got lost on the way. Sorry, I never found the bar, so I'm just.
Oh, sorry. So you
teleporting in.
As you can tell, like Dorothy and Bonner and Alex and I are all really in the bar.
Exactly.
Not at home on our computers. But Roger, it's great to have you here. And I wanted to start with something personal I remember that's meaningful to me. I've only been to one Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship conference. It was in 2004, and I had written some little thing that I can't remember much what it was. But Roger introduced me at that. And he had said he had asked to introduce me, and I was touched by that. So now I get to return the favor by introducing Roger. I'm wearing the same waistcoat I wore in 2004 for this occasion. And I just wanted to say 30 years since I joined this organization, there's always been this name coming up in the background, Roger Stritmatter. And he's among that group that I just mentioned. If his name's on it, you know it's going to be good and rigorous and strong and backed up. But unlike some of the others, like we have a lot of our good scholars that only we know about, Roger has an impact outside Oxfordian circles, even just because of the strength of his work. And the example I wanted to bring up was, I was just reading the other night Bonner's book, Necessary Mischief. And in just one little footnote, Bonner mentioned something about Roger that sort of solidified that for me. It's like in the one little footnote, she said, Stratfordians no longer really use the Tempest as their silver bullet gotcha for eliminating Oxford. And they
will tomorrow, though, after they hear this.
Oh, sure, of course. The way you put it, Bonner, is they're losing interest in using the Tempest. And that's because of your work with Lynn Kazitsky, and it was so strong and solid. They sort of have like pretended that never happened. And
right.
So that's the strength of your work. Someone here on the Blue Boar once said, your Bible work is the closest thing to a smoking gun for Oxford. And from what you've teased with us and at the conference, I think there's more to come there were jaws dropping all around. So yeah. I'm going to stop geeking out like an Oxfordian fanboy and just say, welcome, Professor Stritmatter, and I'll stop babbling and let the conversation go on with Dorothea. I'll let you take
I just want to say thank you, and I'm very happy to be here.
We're very happy to have you. Shall we begin at the beginning of your journey into this world of marginalia and handwriting and an antique book? And just, if you wouldn't mind, just for us, because it's such a wonderful story and it really gives a foundation to everything else you've done, Will you tell us about how you came to work with the Geneva Bible and what you found there and what it led you to?
Well, yes, I'd be happy to. In 1990, I was a all but dissertation student in anthropology, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and so I took 2 years off of grad school and worked in a used bookstore. And it was at that point in Corvallis, Oregon, the Book Bin. And I was very fortunate because the owner of the bookstore needed someone to be a book buyer. And so I got promoted very rapidly to a very fun, but not too well-paying job of buying books in the store. And it was at that time that I saw the Frontline documentary that many of us, for many people, at least in the early 90s, that was our first introduction to the issue, seeing Charlton Ogburn on Frontline being interviewed by Al Austin. And I saw that and I'm like, wow. And it was really the strength of seeing that documentary and then doing a little more reading where I decided, okay, I'm going to go back to grad school in comparative literature, which combined my interest in literature and anthropology. And so I got accepted to the program, of course, without telling anybody that I really wanted to study the authorship question. But I was very lucky because I was in a comparative literature department where I was very free to pursue, my intellectual passion without, people, when people defended that within my department. And within a very short period of time, I just heard this rumor. At first, it was just a rumor that the Folger Library actually owned Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible. I actually heard about that at the very first Shakespeare Oxford Society, as it was then called, a conference that I went to in Palm Beach, Florida in 1990. And Isabel Holden, who was my neighbor in Northampton, Massachusetts, just kind of offhandedly said, "Oh, I'm on my way back to Western Mass. I'm going to stop by the Folger and look at Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible." And I was like, "What did you just say?" And so she was the first person who saw it and let me know about it. And I had a whole nother plan for a dissertation, but I saw this Bible and I saw the annotations and the underlining in it. And I thought, this is what I want to do my dissertation on. And that was in 1990, maybe early, it might have been January 1991 that I first saw it. And I had written this extensive research report on it within less than 18 months, but I didn't feel it was already a dissertation. So really to turn it into a dissertation and finish my coursework took quite a few more years, and it wasn't until 2001 that I actually finished it. But what I learned in it, to summarize, what I learned from it is that the correspondence between the underlined and sometimes annotated passages in Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible, of which we have a record of the purchase of it in 1570 for him by the Court of Wards. It's quite remarkable because, of course, most books from that period you don't have that kind of detailed record keeping on. But because he was a ward of the court, basically, the Crown and William Cecil being in loco parentis to him as a young man, we have the record of that, and it shows that he is fascinated by the same Bible verses, many of the same Bible verses that show up in some cases over and over again in Shakespeare.
Okay, so your dissertation was that comparison, comparing it perhaps to other works of the same time period in order to distinguish it.
Yes. In fact, the one of the requirements for my committee was that I look at data for Bible allusions in other writers. So I looked at Marlowe, Spencer, Rabelais. I don't know if I found stuff from Montaigne, but there were, I ran controls to show that, Shakespeare really is unique not in every respect, but in clearly, easily describable ways. His interest in certain Bible verses that in many cases other people are not noticing or thinking about is quite conspicuous. It is sort of like a fingerprint. I hesitate to use that word because that word sometimes gets misused in this type of a discussion. But yeah, it's different from everybody else's, and it corresponds significantly to what is in the Geneva Bible at the folder. Now, of course, the part of what's interesting about this story is that I believe that my dissertation makes that book infinitely more interesting and more valuable. But it seems that the institution that owns it is not really interested in gaining the benefit from that.
Maybe so.
Someday.
So finishing your dissertation, were you have you been, and we're driving to where you've been over the last several years, and we will get there. Yeah. Listening to you at the conference in New Orleans in November, it struck me that you must have done years and years and years of work on handwriting analysis. And it's something I personally do not know very much about. Thanks to you, I now feel like I have a smidgen of information.
Because the whole thing rests on that is
right about what someone who, what are the qualifications, what do they do? And so I'm just going to step back and let you, and I think Bonner's got some comments as well, talk about what it means to take a look at somebody's handwriting. Handwriting changes over time. We of course have Italic script, we have secretary hand. Could you give us a primer on what all of that means and your journey through it?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's important when we talk about analyzing handwriting, what are we talking about? Because there is a school of thought that you can understand a person's character by looking at their handwriting and analyzing it. That is not what we're talking about here. That is something that may or may not be a science. But what we're talking about is the simple question: when you have two documents, how can you tell if they're written by the same person or by two different people? And that is a science. It's established as a science in the courts. Thank you, Shelley.
More light on you.
Yes, okay, thank you. I was thinking about doing that, but I thought it might be too much light, but you found just the right. So it is a science. So this has been argued extensively in the courts, obviously, because many legal cases can hinge on those types of questions. And so there are board certified forensic analysts whose specialty is in looking at documents and figuring out, forensically what can be determined about them. And that is not limited to handwriting, but it includes handwriting. And the studies show two things that are interesting. One is it does appear that under normal circumstances, handwriting is unique. There are no two people who have exactly the same handwriting. Notice I said under normal circumstances, because you do have masters of handwriting who are able to do quite remarkable things. But normally, each person's handwriting is unique. But handwriting also varies within a document and between documents. So the studies show that trained forensic experts make only 1/6 the number of errors as the layperson. And that is the basis by which the courts have said this is a science and we accept expert testimony in this field. I do not have any formal qualifications in the field, but as you suggest, I've been studying it for a long time. I started off back there in 1990, pulling documents out of the archives and looking for things that might have been written by Edward de Vere. And the first few things that I tried were all wrong. And I hadn't yet learned to distinguish the peculiar aspects of his hand that really make it unique. But when we got to the de Vere Bible and the dissertation, we had to deal with the handwriting. And M.K. Anderson Margot Anderson, then known as Mark Anderson, worked with me to develop really state-of-the-art samples where we took every single letter in the Bible, which is not that many, unfortunately, but it's enough, and lined them up with controls, and hired an external person who is a board certified document analyst, and said to her, give us your report. And she said that she was substantially, as in like, I think to the 95th percentile, certain that it was Edward de Vere. And she stated that the only reason it was not a higher than that was the limited sample. She would have liked a little bit larger sample to be certain. So we learned a tremendous amount on that through working with, a professional. And since that time, I've published, the article that's going to come out in the Journal of Forensic Document Examination about the Audley End annotations will be the second article that I've published with them. So although I don't have a formal training, I have, this will be the second detailed article that I've written that has been accepted by a board of editors that do have professional forensic document qualifications.
They gave you their stamp of approval, obviously.
Correct. And they're very excited about this article. And I think that they see the significance of the evidence that it contains.
So when you look at a early modern hand, we are looking at either italics or we are looking at secretary hand.
Well, mainly, but the truth is there are also some very highly specialized court hands. There's sometimes called chancery. But those you don't really see outside of those governmental documents created by those governmental bureaucracies. So yes, in terms of the letters that you will see, if you look, for example, at the British Library and you go through the Harleian manuscript letters, they are all going to be, or 95% going to be either in what is called the Italic hand or the English secretary hand. The English secretary hand is an evolution of Gothic, and it's actually faster than writing Italic. But starting in the 1520s, Roger Ascham and the Cambridge scholars of his generation were trained in the Italic handwriting, which of course comes out of Italy. And they trained the children of Henry VIII to write in Italic, and that sort of began a cascade effect where by the 1590s, you have quite a few people in England who are using this Italic hand. It's not as fast or economical, but it had a kind of a cachet to it. A very frequent pattern you'll see in the documents is you'll see a letter written in a secretary hand, but signed, if the writer knows how to use Italic as well, in Italic. The Earl of Oxford, so far as we know, I like to think he had a secretary hand as well as Italic, but all that we really know, all the known documents in his handwriting are in Italic. And you mentioned handwriting changing over time. Part of what's remarkable to me about Oxford's handwriting, because I've looked at the whole spectrum, it goes, the earliest letter we have from him, he's only 12 years old, and 12 or 14, one or the other. And we have all the way until 1603, when he's 53 years old. He had remarkable penmanship. And it does not change over time in any visible way. It varies by circumstance, but all the way to the end, it is just remarkably precise and careful and efficient. It's old-fashioned by that time. That's the other thing that's important about italic to realize, is that it doesn't really remain in use that long. By the time you get to the late Jacobean period, what you have is no longer pure italic or pure secretary. You're getting something else that's on its way to becoming cursive. So you can actually tell when you look at, say, either the de Vere Bible or the Audley End books. It is possible to come up with a fairly narrow window in which those annotations had to have been made. I'm guessing about a 50-year window, really, from about 1550 to maybe a little bit after 1600, because people were not doing that after that much.
Roger, I'm just going to throw in kind of a wild question here. If you had to speculate that if Will of Stratford could hold a pen, and if he knew how to write, it's a more general question perhaps, what would someone who was raised the way Will of Stratford was raised, if he could write, what would his hand be? Would it be italic?
Well, it would be much more likely to be a secretary hand, far more likely. And maybe just to connect this back to the theater, which is why we're all interested in this, of the same pattern that I described for correspondence in the play manuscript. The manuscript itself is written in secretary hand. The stage directions and this is a generalization. This won't be true in every case, but this is a common pattern. The stage directions and the names of the characters will be written in italic. In a way, it's the same way that we still use italic as a special font along with Roman. But they didn't really have a Roman hand. They had italic and they had the secretary hand, which is based on Gothic. The secretary hand can be very hard for us to read. There are many secretary hands that I look at today and it would take a long time to try to work it out. Others are pretty easy, but generally italic is a lot easier for us to read still. It looks more like what we're used to thinking letters are supposed to look like.
At your presentation in New Orleans, one of the things that struck me was a very casual statement that you made, which was that these books that you're talking about, the Geneva Bible and certainly the Audley End books, they're made, they're printed, they're produced with wide margins, blank margins, and that's done for the purpose of annotating.
Correct.
And you and I know, have talked about it privately by email, but that's part of, first of all, I'd like you to expand a little bit on that people did commonly annotate their own books. How many of us annotate our books today? Yeah. Some do, but most people don't. I don't usually, unless I spot a glaring mistake in one, and it's a book that I use a lot. But I'm convinced that the reader during the Elizabethan era had a different relationship to a book than the 21st century reader does to a book. And I wonder if you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, great question, Alex. So the first thing I would say is that books are expensive. And they involve a large amount of labor and material to produce. And they are built to last for a long time. There aren't as many different books. The books that are written and published are written with an expectation of, not always in every case maybe, but in many cases with a long-term audience. And they're meant to be difficult in ways that a lot of modern books are not meant to be difficult. They're meant to be transparent and easy to understand. And they're still coming out of the era of the scribal tradition. And that's probably the actually most important angle here on your question, is that the idea that the book is finished once it is published, printed, it was less of a finished product to them. It was something to be used. And so that's why you get, especially in these big folio volumes. So the volumes we're talking about at Audley End are about that wide and about that tall. Not all of them, but the key ones. The Cassius Dio's History of Rome is, and the Dionysius also is. And they have these very, very large margins that, as you say, are designed to be written on. And so that's really the place to begin in thinking about why the Audley End volumes are much more important. Well, I shouldn't put it that way. They're equally important and in a different and more provocative way than the Bible, is that in that Bible, we've got maybe 27 words, a handful of words. In these books, we have 15,000 words or something on that order of amount of material. So we have annotations that consist of, many of them are 10, 15, 20 words in length. And so we're getting a much more complete snapshot into the way in which the reader is responding to what he's reading. In the de Vere Bible, the majority of the evidence is in the underlining. In these books, the majority of the evidence is in the annotations, and that is partly simply a function of what you just asked about, that these books are written, that the de Vere Bible margins are, maybe about like that. And these books, it's like that. So you've got 4 times as much space, and the annotator took advantage of that.
Bonner, did you have anything at the moment? I know you do later.
I'm fascinated by it. I spent all day yesterday working on the forensic attachment that you sent. So I have a lot of more processing to do, but a number of things fascinated me. One is, as you pointed out, that the person who did those annotations had a linguistic versatility. And he was a polyvocal language genius. For example, I would call him a linguistic virtuoso, being liking music stuff that I do.
Okay, that's good.
Cassius Dio is written in Dio, if I'm mispronouncing it, is written in Greek. The annotations are in Latin.
And Greek.
So he's correcting the Greek and in Greek too. But mostly, what you were looking at, you pointed out, of the 30 or so books that you and Shelley could actually examine, he had an exceptional talent for ancient languages. He had the seven books that are notated in 4 languages: Greek, Latin, Italian, and French. They're in those languages. And then he annotated them in Greek, Latin, Italian, and only one little annotation is in English.
Correct.
That's just wild.
It's quite wild.
You noted too, and I do want to ask you, because that's fascinated me, that you wrote that there is only a very small group of people who could have out there that we know of had the kind of education and background to make these annotations. We're looking at a very small set that is really pretty identifiable. So do you want to talk about that some more? Because I was really,
I'd like to do something here, because we keep talking about Audley End, and I'm going to use Alex's maxim that don't assume everyone knows what we're talking about.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I think you were heading toward this, Dorothea, about, Roger, could you tell us, like, at the most basic level, what we're talking about when you say Audley End and what it means?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Wonderful.
So Audley End is an estate in Essex in England, a grand old house that was already a huge mansion in the time of Elizabeth I, and then was expanded during the reign of James II, specifically expanded in order to entertain the king. So that should give you an idea of the scale we're talking about here. So it's a wonderful old mansion that is today part of the run by the National Trust in England, and there is a substantial library there, of which are about 100 books that predate that are Elizabethan, starting from, I think, the earliest ones in the 1530s, but most of them are 1550s through 1580s and 90s. And these books came to my attention a few years ago. Jan Scheffer at one of our SOF conferences came up to me and he said, "Have you seen this book by Casson and Rubinstein about these books at Audley End?" And I had not seen it. It had just come out. And he said, "Well, they say that these books are annotated by Sir Henry Neville, but I think they look to me like they're Edward de Vere's handwriting." So as soon as I got home from the conference, I got myself a copy of this book and I looked at it and I was immediately in agreement. First of all, I was stunned by what the annotations said, and immensely grateful to Casson and Rubinstein, John Casson and Bill Rubinstein, for bringing these things forward. But I could easily see that their argument that they were in Sir Henry Neville's handwriting was very weak. And so that was, about 3 years ago. And since that time, Shelley Maycock, my wife, and I have been able to travel twice to Audley End to take photographs of these books. And as Bonner said, it kind of depends what you count, but there's something between 6 and 8 books that we're talking about, of which 3 are the most interesting. The volume by Cassius Dio, he is a Greek chronicler of Roman history. It contains almost 1,200 annotations, and it's in that book that we find the really interesting ones that connect directly to, especially to Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. And the connections are obvious and dramatic and difficult to ignore. The understanding of the de Vere Bible as a document depends on a lot of really careful, close reading. You've got to be very patient. I don't think that's so much true for these Audley End books. They are going to be much, much harder to sort of laugh off or pretend that they're not important.
Well, in a way, it's like everybody who was reading and annotating Bibles back then. Okay, so what? That's what they say. But it's harder when you have annotations in a history about Antony and Cleopatra that look like they're written by somebody with a playwright's mind. And this is known to be a volume that Shakespeare, the author, used as a source.
Indeed. And you mentioned the playwright's mind. So let's insert here just a little tidbit here that there is a theme in these annotations of theatrical history. The annotator, for example, takes a note on Pompey's theater, which is where in Julius Caesar is assassinated. And in the sources, that's where he's assassinated. But the annotator is also interested in when, under a later emperor, when the actors are expelled from Italy. He takes a note about Nero deciding that he's going to go onto the stage in Milan and not in Rome. Quite an interesting and eclectic collection of different annotations on sort of different aspects of theaters and theatrical history. So along with law and lots of other things that are perhaps maybe more predictable, it's clear to me that this writer was interested in the law, the annotator very interested in the law, but that's not perhaps as surprising as his clear interest in the theater.
One thing that struck me, I've only had a chance to skim some of your notes that you sent us, but some of the annotations almost like he's writing stage directions down, like he's writing key moments like, oh, Cleopatra does this, then this person enters. And you go, these could be stage directions.
They are a lot like stage directions, and that is a comparison and analogy that I tend to develop. The thing is, they aren't stage directions. They're summaries of the action in the narrative that he's reading, but they are summaries, they're of action, but also they're about characters. It's obvious that the annotator is keeping track of things about characters that appear in these plays and
like key moments and
key moments, absolutely. So it's a slightly different genre than the stage direction, but they have in common, you're onto something, they have in common that sense of condensing a lot of stuff that's going on. And it's very easy to see the connection between the way he's summarizing in the notes and stage directions. You're right.
Yeah, it struck me as a mind that's thinking, oh, this would make a good moment.
Absolutely. Exactly so. Exactly so.
Do you see anything that takes you to the language written in the canon, Roger?
Oh, well, absolutely.
Can you describe some of those moments?
Well, so let me go at this in a little bit of an oblique way, because one of the types of annotations, this type is a little bit less well documented because it's hard to see sometimes, but very often he'll just write a Latin gloss for a Greek word. So he's obviously like thinking back and forth in between the Greek and the Latin. So one example, when you talk about language, I should say I'm still studying these materials. So everything that I have to say about them is kind of in flux a little bit. But one interesting example would be, there's a note that it says concerning the character of Marcus Brutus. And the text alongside of that note is describing actually what the conspirators did to get Brutus enlisted into the conspiracy, which, as you recall, Cassius gets Cinna, the conspirator, to forge these letters and then toss them in at Brutus's casement, and then he finds them in the middle of the night and he's reading them, and he says it's like the omens are whizzing through the sky. And he's like, well, there's so much light, I don't even need a candle to read this by. And the letter, one of the refrains of the letter is Brutus, thou sleeps awake. And that's repeated 2 or 3 times in the speech. The passage in Cassius Dio next to the note about Brutus's character is that same thing, and it includes that specific language, thou sleeps awake. Now, just earlier today, I went back and reread one of the 2 other alternative sources, and that is not in there. Now, this is why I preface this with saying it's in flux. I'm not sure that this is unique yet to this particular, to Dio. But that's an example of where the language that is being annotated is very directly and unquestionably being mirrored in Shakespeare's text. And there are some other ones. I think I may have spoken my conference talk. I talked about this remarkable thing where Cleopatra has a meeting with Octavius Caesar after Mark Antony has died. And there's an annotation that describes that meeting. And then there is written the Greek participle she blushing, describing Cleopatra. Because Caesar has said to Cleopatra, did you give me a complete accounting of all your properties? And her treasurer, who is standing by, rats her out and says, well, she's kept back as much as she can purchase all the rest that she told you about. And at that point, Caesar says, nay, Cleopatra, do not blush. The only source in which Cleopatra blushes in that interview is Cassius Dio. And we have the annotator writing the Greek word for she blushing in the margins.
So what we've got here, it sounds like, Roger, is an actual book from the time that is known, pretty much acknowledged to be a source Shakespeare the playwright used, with a lot of handwriting margins that seem to show a playwright's mind. And it's in Edward de Vere's handwriting.
I should put a caveat there. So the only part of that is possibly in doubt, but it should be made clear, is the part about this definitely being a source. Okay. There are essentially 3 main, there are a bunch of minor sources and 3 major sources for those two plays, for Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. By far and away, the most important one is Plutarch's Lives, the life of Antony, the life of Caesar, and the life of Brutus. This is Plutarch's text is clearly the most influential on Shakespeare, and is probably the last one that he read in actually studying to write the play, I would argue. Now, of course, we know that Edward de Vere owned a copy of the Amiot French Plutarch that North's 1579 English translation was based on. So he owned that book, but we don't have it, and we don't have his annotations in it, so we don't know really anything about it beyond the fact that he owned it. After that, the book that is most commonly cited is Appian's History of Rome. Appian and Cassius Dio are very similar, but Appian ends before the time period that Antony and Cleopatra deals with. So the point I'm making here is that Dio is an understudied source for Shakespeare. It contains material relevant to both of those two Roman plays. And I think that this discovery is going to allow us to see that it's much more influential than has been thought. But mainly, Shakespeare scholars talk about Appian and Plutarch as the two main sources. And they kind of ignore Dio. Why? Well, largely because Appian was translated into English in 1578. So you don't have to have a Shakespeare who knows Greek in order to see that as being a source. And that's kind of the way they've played the game. So I'm sorry,
again,
I just want to clarify that. Go ahead.
Very helpful. So again, it's a case of what they study is determined by what they think their guy could have read.
Right.
And to get back to Dorothea's and the question somebody had is, so it sure looks to you like these annotations are in the same handwriting as in the Bible, right?
And I'm going to say, and how do you know, Roger?
Yeah, well, you don't have, no one has to take my word for it, because I spent pretty much the whole summer from June until September writing this report. And I mean, at the conclusion of the article, I put in a pitch for my results to be tested. And if there are Stratfordians or anybody who really, wants to cover the same territory, I don't have any question as to what any competent forensic analyst would conclude when the materials are looked at. And I, developed, it's an 18,000 word essay with about 10 different things that I look at, different characteristics of the, first I go through and show that it's not Neville, which is pretty easy to do. And then I use the same tests in the paper that I use to prove that it's not Neville with Oxford sample, and you see the opposite result.
Can you give us a little description of what some of those tests might be?
Well, that's why I had prepared some visuals, but as you know, we kind of got messed up. But one interesting example that I can describe without a visual aid, that's actually extremely useful, is that there's more than one way of writing an S in the Italic handwriting. The most common way is a long S that goes like that. It looks like an F, but it just doesn't have a crossbar. Other than that, it's an F. And then there's a short S, which is just like that usually goes at the end of the word. And when you get two S's in the middle of the word, you have a question of how do you join them together? And so how do you join them? And it turns out that there's about 5 major ways and maybe 10 ways, if you look at some of the weirder ones, but 5 major ways that writers of the period did that. And so looking at that one letter, you can reliably predict that the annotator is not Sir Henry Neville, because they do it in a completely different way. It's a different motion of the hand. Oxford uses a much more conservative, older way of doing that. Neville's hand is on the way to becoming cursive. His pen doesn't leave the page as often. when you look at that same comparison with Oxford and the Audley End annotator, you see the same thing. I did a lot of work in this article with slant. Okay, the one major discrepancy that is systematically the case between the sample of the letters that we have for Edward de Vere and these Audley End annotations is that in the letters, there's a greater degree of slant. He is writing on a flat piece of paper, the hand is in motion across the page, and the letters are going to show a slant on average about like that. But when he's writing in the margins of a book, that slant goes up to about this much. And that also affects some other aspects of the letter as well. But fortunately, this is where the de Vere Bible turned out to be extremely useful, because I was able to show in this article that is coming out the same phenomenon in the de Vere Bible and the Audley End annotations. In both cases, that writing is about 15 to 20 degrees more upright than what we see in de Vere's letters. So I really think I did a thorough job of not only showing the distinguishing characteristics that show that this is the same hand, but I also considered the counter argument and showed why it is not valid. So that's why I feel very confident in saying, whatever I would welcome. In fact, I hope that some of the labs like Cedar Fox at University of Buffalo that I've worked with before, they have their own computerized methodology, as do law enforcement agencies all over the world. I have little doubt that they would come up with the same conclusion that I have. What I did was didn't use that high-tech stuff that they have, and I don't have the statistical, proof, but the advantage of what I did is that anybody can look at it and draw their own conclusion. And I think if you look at even a significant amount of the evidence, you will realize that it's a fairly cut and dried case.
And it just sounds like common sense about the slant is we'd probably all do the same as if we had a limited, tight little thing, we wouldn't be sprawling it out. We'd be tightening it up.
Exactly. So I think that the forward momentum of the hand slows down, and you're trying to avoid getting to that edge. Even if you've got 2.5 inches, it's still not the same as 8 inches. So yeah, it's a fairly it accords with our intuitive understanding of what happens when the circumstance of writing changes.
Roger, you have a couple of theories about how these books came to Audley End.
Yeah, somebody asked about the provenance a moment ago.
Yeah, so the main reason that Casson and Rubinstein felt secure in claiming that these were annotated by Sir Henry Neville is that they were indeed in his library, as far as we can tell. I don't actually know that as a fact for myself, but I'm willing to concede that the evidence looks that way, and it probably is certainly the case, most likely. Certainly, they came to Audley End around 1920 when Neville's estate, his Billingborough estate, which I think is in Hertfordshire. Anyway, it's called Billingsbury. It was fallen into disrepair, and it suffered a fire. I think the books were moved before the fire. I'm not sure about that, but they were moved to Audley End for safekeeping. So they were in Neville's library. Neville lived until 1615. And Neville is a very interesting and important person in all this. He was a very smart man and a very interesting man. And he was caught up with the Essex conspiracy. And he spent 2 years in the Tower along with the Earl of Southampton. Now, part of what's interesting about these books is that none of them are literary. None of the literary books that we looked at in this collection could we find any connection to Oxford. These are all books that have to do with history and specifically a kind of history that that the Essex, I don't really want to call them conspirators, but the Essex faction, they were very interested in history. And Sir Henry Savile, who was Sir Henry Neville's very tutor and very close friend, was the chief intellectual to the Essex faction. His annotations are in some of these books. So we've got a situation where we've got books that have a few annotations by Sir Henry Neville, a lot of annotations by Sir Henry Savile, and even more annotations by what looks to be Edward de Vere. What do they have in common? Well, it seems reasonably clear to most of us that although Oxford didn't get wrapped up in the Essex thing, he was sympathetic to Southampton. He was sympathetic to their cause. To me, it's highly plausible that these books were loaned to Neville and Southampton when they were in the Tower. They are the kind of books that would have moved at that point in time. You know, that's what they would have been interested in reading. Oxford dies within 2 or 3 years of that, and Neville lives, you know, until 1615. I don't know that that's the Provenance, but that's one possibility. What is certain is that Neville and Oxford had common interest in language and literature and international diplomacy and politics. All of those things were things that they had in common, and they had Southampton in common. You know, they were both connected to Southampton. So everybody wants to know what Provenance is, but having thought about this and worked on it a lot, forensic analysis trumps knowing the Provenance. In other words, you can't say that, well, it must be Neville because Neville owned the books. That makes no sense. Many of us have bought books that were annotated by other people. We didn't make the annotations ourselves. We acquired them after they were made. I wish we had a clearer answer about the Provenance, but I don't think that the Provenance can in any way be used really to cast doubt on the conclusions of the forensics.
Any wrap-up thoughts from Bonner or Alex or Dorothea? Or even from you, Roger?
Where do you go from here?
Well, so Elizabeth Winkler is very interested in this and will be pitching some stories on it. I am thinking about how to turn this into a book and several articles. The research report that I sent you, it's kind of like my most condensed version of the really good stuff. I don't know if that's the way to publish it. I'm not sure. But I do think, I said 30 years ago that we were going to find more books from Oxford's library. And of course, it took a long time. And we found some others in the interim. We've got the Herodotus and we've got a few other books. So we're starting to recreate what his library looked like. But I never in my wildest imagination thought that we were going to find something this good. I mean, we're talking, one of the ones I was going to show you that I kind of set up is the note about the killing of Cinna, the poet, who is in Julius Caesar, who the mob, so Mark Antony riles up the mob to want revenge for Caesar's killing. And in the process, they kill Cinna the poet, thinking that who is actually a tribune of the people. This is intense irony here, right? This is the Roman people tearing limb from limb Cinna the poet, who's a tribune of the people, because they think that he's representing he was one of the conspirators simply because there's another Cinna of the same name who was a conspirator. So you have this annotation that is about the whole concept of a confusion of names. And that's not the only one. That actually is a thematic issue that shows up in at least 2 or 3 other places. So I just think, and for both of those 2 Roman plays, we can put together an entire sequence that covers major elements of plot. It's not the whole play in exactly the order that it appears in, because he rearranges stuff as he's composing it. But some of the sequences of annotations are really pretty stunning. So I think the biggest challenge, and I should probably throw this back to y'all. I mean, I need your help in terms of figuring out how to move forward with this. I have some ideas. I've laid the foundations. But I think that we could leverage this into something that could be really significant. But I feel like more significant than anything else, certainly that I've done up until this point.
As we're coming to a close, somebody says, and I think what they mean by this is there another Zoom meeting scheduled? Like, can you come back, Roger, some other time?
I'd love to, sure, of course.
For another episode.
I think it'd be fun to get those slides up sometime. I think people would really, really enjoy them.
Pretty stunning, I think.
Yeah, I mean, also, to mention, there is, of course, Roger's video from the most recent conference on YouTube. So,
and there is a lot of material available on my website. It's shake-spears-bible.com. And if you put in some combination of that and my name, it'll come up. And there are a few, there are both videos and some images, lots of images from the de Vere Bible and some from these Audley End books that are already up there.
Any final thoughts, Alex Bonner? I think we got to wrap up, but it's too soon, but I'm sorry, but.
No, it's certainly, it's one of the most exciting, I've been in this about as long as you have, 30 years, and it's one of the most exciting potential developments. And I really hope it gets some traction.
Thank you. I hope so too.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Roger. It's been an honor.
Fun. Take care.
Bye.
Take care. Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming in. Oh, I knew it. Somebody always forgets their keys. There you go. Well, it was nice having you. I hope you enjoyed what you saw. If you liked it, again, give us a like or a subscribe there at the tip jar at your table. And if you want to learn more all about this, go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. Just look them up and you'll find tons more information on everything Edward de Vere and Shakespeare. It's been great having you. Safe drive home. Take care.